we will have passed the policy. That is the part that whatever the voters want, whatever Congress wants, like that suggests to me such hypocrisy that I am just beside myself with anger.
I'm Kimberly Atkins Stohr, and this is Justice by Design. So when I talk about the national debt, when I say that phrase, what does it mean to you? One thing I worry about is that for most Americans, it doesn't mean enough. People really don't understand what a rising national debt could mean for them, how it impacts them at their kitchen tables, how it impacts their businesses, and how it could lead to our children and their children being worse off than we are. And that's not the American dream at all. So to help explain this, I am very, very happy to be joined by Wendy Edelberg, who is a senior fellow of economic studies at the Brookings Institution. Wendy, welcome to Justice by Design.
So happy to be here.
So before we get started in our conversation, briefly introduce yourself to our listeners and let them know who you are and what you do there at Brookings.
Yeah, so I am, as you said, senior fellow in economic studies at Brookings. What that means is that I put out pieces on what I think is happening with inflation, immigration, fiscal policy, what I think tariff policy is doing to the economy. I'm a macroeconomist, so I have a broad remit. Until recently, I ran something called the Hamilton Project, which is a center at Brookings that focuses on getting concrete policy ideas supported by academic research, getting those ideas in front of policymakers. And then what's related to this conversation we're having today, before that, I was chief economist at the Congressional Budget Office.
All right. So I will be calling on all that expertise in this conversation to explain to our listeners and to me. I mean, I have some grasp of all of this, but even I am trying to just better understand what's going on, especially right now as we have been debating the budget and the national debt over the past couple of weeks. So just so that we understand what we're talking about, when we say the national debt and the way that it's ballooning, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, the important number is debt held by the public. So U.S. Treasury goes in almost on a weekly basis and sells treasuries, and in return for those treasuries gets money. Often it's just rolling over treasuries. Oh, I've gone down a rabbit hole, but I'll explain it. I'm gonna do this. So a treasury matures, and it has to make a payment on that treasury. So it makes a payment, but to find the money to make that payment, it goes into the market and it sells another treasury. So it's basically.
So when you're talking about treasury, do you mean bonds or?
Oh yeah. I've gotten way too technical, way too fast.
It's okay. It's okay.
I mean bonds. I mean U.S. Treasury securities. I mean 10-year treasuries. I mean 1-year treasuries. I mean 1-month treasury bills. All of that. That is just an asset that the U.S. government sells. And when we give the U.S. Treasury money, we in return get that asset. That asset pays interest, and that is just all of us probably literally all of us. If you think about what your pension might be holding, if you put money in the bank and you're earning interest on a checking account, albeit not very much interest, your bank is holding treasuries. So, we are probably literally every single one of us listening to this conversation today, somehow lending to the U.S. government. And the way that we do that is we buy the treasuries that the U.S. government is selling. That number is, I'm going to give you the exact number. It's $28.95 trillion. So that's just an unfathomably large number to get a handle on. And so it's useful to think about that number relative to the size of the economy and so debt as a share of GDP. And though I'm gonna give you that number too, but I want to say, because you're going to see that number is going to be pretty close to 100. There's nothing magical about debt as a share of GDP being 99%, 100% versus 101%. Nothing happens, nothing breaks.
Mm,
It's just a nice benchmark.
sure.
And so right now it is nearly 100%, and it is projected to go higher. And if what's being debated in Congress right now passes, it will go even higher.
So, why do we need to have so much debt as a country? I mean, we're taught as individuals that it's not good to carry large amounts of debt, that we should pay our bills so that we are not over leveraged. Why does the government operate that way?
In many ways, it makes absolute perfect sense for the federal government to borrow from the public and for us to have a national debt. Uh, One is that the U.S. government, the federal government, is making a lot of long-term investments in various ways that are going to pay off over a long time, and because it's taking the long view as we want it to take the long view, it makes perfect sense to borrow to make those investments. I'm thinking about investments really broadly in terms of investing in the healthcare of children,
Hmm.
the education of children, um, investing in the military to make sure we're safe. That has a long term payoff. So in many ways, it makes perfect sense for our children and our children's children to uh, help finance all of those endeavors. I'll also say that the global financial system, which is to say all of us and everybody else in the world who also has money and is trying to figure out what to do with it, has a really unending appetite for U.S. Treasury securities. And so it also, for that reason, makes perfect sense for the U.S. government to have debt. So you don't want to think of it as the kid, a family's budget is really not the best analogy
Okay.
unless you're willing to think about, a family's budget including student loans, including a mortgage,
Hmm.
including, there are lots of ways that families borrow for the future, but there's no sense in which the government should be balancing its budget every year. Now, I'm going to make a huge caveat to what I just said,
Okay.
or amendment to what I just said, which is the big reason that we have so much debt is that we keep passing fiscal policy that demands a whole lot of federal spending, which we presumably really value.
Hmm.
And at the same time, we pass revenue policy, tax policy that is not nearly enough to pay for it. So we have chosen to finance a lot of our spending through borrowing instead of through taxation.
I see.
And that's not a terrible choice, but it does have negative economic ramifications, which I'm sure we're going to talk about.
Yeah, and I want to talk about those first before we dive into some of the things that are in the bill that is being debated as we speak. So, okay, so the national debt in itself is not a bad thing, but it's certainly bad when it gets too big or when it can't be repaid, right? So, I want to talk about, I mean, we talk about, I hear the term fiscal crisis thrown around the same way that I talk a lot about the
Yeah.
constitutional crisis, which I think has already happened. But what is the fiscal crisis? Like, does that mean we're in default? Does that mean that we are growing the deficit at a faster speed than we are bringing in revenue? When is the point that, in your opinion, we as Americans, as and policy makers, need to take action to draw this back a bit?
Yeah, all great questions. So let's step back a minute and just
Mhm.
talk about some of the more boring economics behind why uh,
Boring but important.
boring but
Important.
important of why having debt matters for the economy, why increasing the amount that the U.S. Treasury is borrowing has just day in and day out economic effects. And the reason it does is because the more the U.S. government is in there in the market trying to borrow from you and me and banks and everybody else. The more we're lending to the US government, the less we're lending to other people and other firms. And, so there's a bit of, the old supply and demand thing going on, which is the more that the US Treasury is in there as a borrower trying to demand funds, the higher the cost of borrowing is going to go up. And the way that we're going to feel that is higher interest rates. So it is one of a handful of reasons. It's not the only reason, but it's one of a handful of reasons why mortgage rates are as high as they are. Why it's as costly as it is for a firm to get a loan from the bank, or, going out and selling a bond in the market. It boosts interest rates. What that also means, just at the same time, is that because it's costlier for firms to invest because that interest rate is higher, we're just going to have less investment in the private sector. So the more the federal government borrows, the less private sector investment we're going to have. And that's just going to mean our economy is smaller. Now, I don't want to overstate how big these effects are. They're not huge, but they're not nothing. And so when I say we've chosen to finance our spending through borrowing, and that has costs, that we apparently have just chosen to bear, those are costs and they're measurable. But this is not even in the ballpark of what people have in mind when they talk about a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
These are not apples and oranges. These are apples and Tonka trucks. They're just entirely different things. So what creates a fiscal crisis? So fundamentally, there are a bunch of ways so that we could get a fiscal crisis. One of them you alluded to is what happens when we just can't pay back our debt. Like, when does that happen? When do we get there? And one way of thinking about when we might get there is, could we conceivably, if financial markets said, we're starting to get worried about whether or not you actually can make these payments over time, do we have the ability, do we have the room as a country, putting politics aside, do we have room as a country to raise enough revenue to immediately stabilize the debt, keep it from growing, and start balancing the budget? And here's the thing. Our tax revenues as a share of GDP in the United States are really low. They're pretty low relative to our history, and they're going to get even lower if this bill is passed. And they're quite low relative to other advanced rich countries.
So that's a good segue to get into this budget. Now, of course, any budget is a statement of the priorities of the executive branch, and through passing it, through the priorities of the legislature too. So depending on what party's in power and who is calling the shots, those individual judgments will be different. But in this bill, and I'm oversimplifying what's in it, this bill proposes a great deal of spending on things like immigration enforcement. The Defense Department always takes up a big part of spending. That's nothing new. But also calls for a lot of tax cuts for certain brackets, particularly higher income earners, in a way that has drawn a lot of derision from people in the Democratic Party about how that's happening. So if you can get into the policies to the extent that you wish, but I really want to sort of get an idea of this bill based on past budgets. The income tax changes seem pretty drastic in this case to me. Is that the way it looks to you?
So if I were to point to more drastic parts of this bill, I mean, some of the more drastic parts are only there for a limited time. So, we're like throwing up our hands and saying, oh, just that silly Congress, not taxing tips, not taxing overtime, giving seniors $6,000 a year in tax credits. Oh, pshaw, how long could that last? I mean, maybe it won't last very long, but those are very significant changes, albeit short lived. There are, moving away from the tax side, there are big changes in how people can sign up for Medicaid and who's eligible and how hard it is to get Medicaid, and will result in many fewer people being able to get Medicaid. And then even if you can get it, it will be way more onerous, with an administrative burden of having to like sign up all the time and show your paperwork all the time and show that you're working and show that you're eligible. And they have purposefully made Medicaid harder to get. They have, they've put in significant cuts to SNAP, which is just going to mean that some families go hungry. I mean,
Right.
like,
so these are cost cutting, to be sure, but it's about the priorities and which Americans are bearing the burden of that cost cutting.
I mean, I think you also said it though correctly, which Americans voted for. So, apparently we want this as a country. We are now, one of the things that in this bill, you mentioned immigration. We are now for the first time going to make it cost money for someone who's, coming from a dangerous country and coming into the United States and seeking asylum here. We're going to charge them money for that, to go through that process. And then if they want to get a work permit, and they want to apply for a work permit, again, we're going to charge them. And then we're going to tell them that work permit, if they get it, is only good for 6 months. And then they're going to have to keep reapplying. And each time they apply for a work permit, it's going to cost them $550.
So this is not only deferring the cost of our government to people who are in the least position to pay it, but also, I mean, that's also got to stifle the economy. You want people to be able to come here, quickly get a work permit, and while their immigration process, whichever platform that may be on, whether they're seeking asylum, just seeking to immigrate legally, get a green card, it will make it harder for them to contribute to the economy at a time where people are hiring, where there are jobs to be had, and not enough people to take them. So this seems entirely backwards in terms of fiscal policy to me.
Though again, it seems to be what the voters wanted. It looks like what voters were supporting was a big reduction in immigration, and in fact, Trump's immigration policies and what's in this bill, I estimate with two colleagues just put something out on July 2nd, right? Yes, just put something out on July 2nd. We estimate that the monthly payroll employment gains, like, when you open up the newspaper and you see, oh, the jobs number came out, that number when we're at full employment is going to not be like 150,000 like we saw just in the most recent data. That full employment number is going to be like 40,000, 10,000. In 2027, it could be negative, which, Japan is in the midst of, dealing with a shrinking labor force and shrinking jobs numbers. It won't break our economy, but it is a significant change. If I can, what I want to now do is bring this back to the budget.
Yes.
One thing that I find particularly galling is that, yes, okay, this is the package that voters wanted. It's Congress's prerogative to enact it, even though it is nowhere near, if I got the magic wand, I would ask them to enact. But it will put us, what passed the Senate and is now being, negotiated in the House, will put us on track to borrow an additional roughly $25 trillion over the next decade.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of talk about whatever. That's the number I'm going to focus on. That's not a number that you hear in the media a lot. but I think it's the most important number. The Republicans who are voting for this bill are radically changing fiscal policy. And so we really need to think about what will be required in terms of borrowing to finance this world that they are setting in motion. Well, it will require another $25 trillion in borrowing over the next decade. And yet, the Senate package raises the debt ceiling by a mere $5 trillion. So what the Senate is saying is, we know that we are passing policy that has revenues way shy of spending, and that we're asking Treasury, in fact, we're kind of we're telling Treasury to borrow another 25 trillion over the next decade to support all these goals that we've laid out. And yet, once the Treasury borrows another $5 trillion, we're going to tell Treasury they're not allowed to borrow another dollar. That is nonsensical. And it suggests to me that this Congress really hasn't grappled with the ramifications of the bill that they are now contemplating. They need to embrace that the world that we want over the next decade is going to require significant borrowing and all the consequences of that borrowing. And for Pete's sake, don't then tie the hands of Treasury and say, you're not allowed to borrow. We will have passed the policy. That is the part that whatever the voters want, whatever Congress wants, that suggests to me such hypocrisy that I am just beside myself with anger.
Can we talk a little bit more about what the impact of that will be? I mean, because if you need this money and the Treasury is hamstrung to get it, what does that mean for Social Security? What does that mean for Medicare?
So we have had a series of near crises with the debt ceiling. And, again, we're going to come back to what could create a fiscal crisis. We have this, we do this dumb thing in the US. We're pretty unique in doing this, which is that we pass tax policy, we pass spending policy. Those basically just mathematically create, a path for borrowing. That's that the U.S. Treasury needs to do. But then really oddly at the same time, Congress passes, a limit on the amount that the U.S. Treasury can borrow. They implement a debt ceiling. And obviously, just these things cannot all work together. Now, what has happened in the past is every time we've come close to hitting the debt ceiling, which is to say, getting to a day where literally there's no more money in the U.S. Treasury bank account and they can't pay the bills. We have come literally within days of that. Congress has raised the debt ceiling.
Right.
So here's the consequences of what they're doing. What they're doing is in 2.5 years, they will have engineered this crisis, and we will have a big debate around raising the debt ceiling. And I mean, I'm not a particularly political animal. I'm an economist. I do my thing. I do my analysis and take my analysis for what it's worth. But anyone who voted for this bill, who then in 2.5 years says, I demand, spending cuts in order to raise the debt ceiling. I can't believe we need to raise the debt ceiling. I am putting my marker down now that I will air this podcast and say, this is when I started yelling at you in the past,
Yes.
So the reason that could create a crisis is because there are a whole lot of policymakers who have said in past debt ceiling, near crises, oh, for Pete's sake, don't raise it. Let's just see what we're going to discipline Treasury. Don't raise it. And that is, I mean, now we're going to talk a little, I said that like a household with a household budget, it's not a good analogy.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, it's kind of a good analogy. It's a little bit like a household saying, wow, I owe money on my mortgage. I owe the babysitter money. I owe the guy who mowed my lawn money.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I owe my kids college money. But you know what? So sorry. I've hit my borrowing limit. And there's no money in the checking account. I've hit my limit. You
Yeah.
guys are just out of luck. If only I hadn't hit my borrowing limit. I mean, so it's a little bit, what happens is that you can get to a day where the US Treasury says, we literally can't pay the bills. And that is a day that I worry could actually trigger a fiscal crisis, because I think the fundamental thing that could trigger a fiscal crisis is not like borrowing grinding ever higher.
Yeah.
It's financial markets, which sounds abstract, but it's just people like you and me holding Treasury securities.
Mm-hmm.
All of us saying we've lost faith
Yeah.
in the federal government. And that can happen when debt to GDP is 100%, 60%, 120%. Like, that's just us saying, you guys are clowns.
Yeah. So what is the solution then? I mean, you mentioned, for example, the really dumb way that we do fiscal policy as a nation, which is we separate these things and don't think about it in a holistic way. Is it the way that we fund the government that needs to change? Is it the priorities? How do we fix what it seems to be? I mean, I've been in Washington for 19 years, and every single one of the years I've been here, we've been in some sort of debt ceiling crisis. And you think, maybe we should fix this.
Yes.
Maybe this isn't the best way to do it. What do solutions actually look like, and how realistic is it that we can implement them?
So, in a narrow sense, the solution is to get rid of the debt ceiling. And in fact, President Trump said we should get rid of the debt ceiling. To truly get rid of it would probably have to happen in a bipartisan way. But I mean, in a narrow sense, that's the way to solve this problem.
Right. But in actuality, there's always one party in power and one party that is not, and the
Yes.
one that is not is going to fight
Yes.
the party that is in power, even though it will stay the same when the parties of power switch.
But I think the broader answer to your question of like, how do we fix this, is that it's not just policymakers' fault. It's we as a country have to grapple more honestly with what we want our federal government to do, what federal spending we value, and then, having made that choice, say, we want to tax ourselves, or we accept the reality that we have to tax ourselves to pay for that federal spending we value. And we just have not had that honest conversation with ourselves. So the idea that policymakers are going to put in place a big tax increase and perhaps a spending decrease to put us on a more sustainable fiscal trajectory, the idea that they're going to do that when the public isn't calling for it just strikes me as fanciful.
Yeah.
And so we're, the public seems to be allergic to the tax conversation. And in fact, if we talk about raising taxes, the language we often use or hear is about taxes as punishment.
Yes.
I don't want to raise taxes on that guy because I don't like that guy.
Right.
And
yeah,
that can be part of a change in tax policy, but the bigger issue is we just need to raise revenue. And that means raising revenue on people, raising taxes on people who make $150,000 a year. That means like recognizing that people all across the income spectrum, except for the people who were like really financially struggling,
Mhm.
like saying we value what the federal government does and we're going to pay for it. That's a different universe than the one I have lived in with you in
Yes.
DC for the past 19 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're putting on, just from what you said earlier about, what the people voted for, um, to this, that, we don't make tax a digestible election issue. It seems that you don't expect a discussion about the national debt to come back down to your vote matters and elections have consequences, but that's exactly what it is. And that's exactly how voters should think when they are casting their votes for president, for Congress, and even in their state houses, that fiscal policy is not just the priorities of the people who we're electing, but it's our priorities too. It's who we think we are as a
Yes.
country and the way we should allot our resources as a country and how responsible we are fiscally when we do that. But that's harder. That's harder than just the barehanded political fights that we're so used to now. And also just being lawmakers just not being fully transparent about their plans on fiscal policies in a way that voters can be as responsive as they ought to be.
And instead, what policymakers do is they they like dangle the debt numbers in, like how many dollars would you have to stack up to the moon and back? How many times would those
Yes.
dollars go around the earth?
Right.
Um, in a way that's just a scare tactic. Where no,
Hmm.
I mean, what I think, as I said at the beginning, I think our debt's just making our economy a little smaller.
Yeah.
But the, I'm not out there trying to scare people. Um, as long as we have credible policymakers and strong institutions like the Federal Reserve, like the U.S. Treasury, like, you know, uh, strong financial institutions and public institutions, the public will very likely want to lend to the U.S. government. And, interest rates will be a little higher as we borrow more and more, but, some interest rates will be a little higher. That's the cost. Um, but the day policymakers really look like they're going to embrace being irresponsible. I'm angry enough that I keep, I keep thinking
You're
of
using
language
your
that
words carefully.
I
I
have to,
appreciate that.
I keep thinking of language that I can't use. Uh, you know, like the day policymakers truly lose the trust
Yeah.
of the public,
Hmm.
um, that's, and that's a political issue. That's political malpractice. That's not
Right.
about grindingly higher debt. That's that's about political malpractice creating a fiscal crisis. And as much as I'm not worried about the effects of grindingly higher debt, particularly, I am wildly worried about that kind of political malpractice.
I'm thinking you use that word trust, and on currency, we have "in God we trust." I guess the more realistic phrase would be "in our lawmakers we must trust."
Yeah.
And when we lose that, we're in big trouble.
Yes.
Wendy Edelberg, you have made me smarter in this discussion, and I really appreciate you helping to explain to me and our listeners why tax policy is our values, all of our values, and the role that we play in ensuring that we do not drive off a financial cliff. Thank you so much for joining me on Justice by Design.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for listening. And don't forget to subscribe to Justice by Design wherever you get your podcasts. You can also check out the pod on YouTube, where you can see me have discussions with people like Wendy about solutions to the biggest problems we face as a society. I will see you next time. I'm Kimberly Atkins Stohr, and this is Justice by Design.